The sun was setting on the Falkund village. Emil was standing watch at the arbiter's hut. It was a long day. Forces of the High King had once again demanded tribute from the village. The problem with this demand was that they had nothing to give. Rogue imperial troops had sacked their village recently, dozens died, and most of the houses were burnt to the ground. To add on to their list of problems, their warehouse was sacked, and the grain taken. It was disastrous. The Druids abandoned them in their time of need. Their reasoning was that this was a mere culling of the weak. Emil could feel his hands freezing. The winter was nearing, and they were completely out of supplies. He tightly clenched his spear. The Druids refused to assist them with enchanting their weapons, too. The Arbiter was the only shred of hope they had left. He was the man which held the power to enchant arms within his grasp. But a single man can only do so much. The Arbiter needed time to rest, time the village didn't have. If the High King would act and seize their last belongings, some might even be sold into slavery to pay the tribute to the king. They got protection from nothing, and in exchange they sold their entire lives to this pathetic monarch. Anger swelled in Emil's heart, and yet there was nothing he could do. He hadn't eaten in a week, sleep too was hard to come by. And yet there were 100 or so souls which depended on him. He couldn't falter, not now, not ever. Emil once again opened his eyes and spotted something. 5 silhouettes were approaching. Were these the High King's men? The 5 figures continued encroaching into the village. Emil heard his captain scream, "Everyone, form a spear line at the gate!" The man yelled, "Everyone who is on guard, notify the person you're guarding and rush to the spear line." There was a chorus of, "Yes, Captain," and the men quickly got into position. Emil, too, quickly moved to notify the Arbiter. First, he knocked on the door of the hut. "Yes, what's happening?" the Arbiter yelled back. "Come in," he added. Emil did as the Arbiter suggested and entered. "Sire, 5 people are encroaching. They may be a scouting party for the High King's forces." Emil informed him. "I need to aid the defense of the gate," he said. Nobody had ever seen the Arbiter's face, and yet it was a well-known fact that he was a talented magician and enchanter. "Very well, I'll come with you," he said. Emil looked confused. "I'm a sorcerer, remember?" "Right, sire," Emil said as they quickly rushed to the gate. "State your intentions!" the captain yelled at the figures. The silhouettes were quickly approaching. The closer they came, the more the ground quaked, the larger they seemed. After a few more minutes of this agonizing waiting, they came to a halt. "We're here to meet with Narration the Elder," one of them said in fluent Orcish. The Arbiter took a step forward. The captain tried to stop him, but was pushed to the side. "So my time has finally come," the Arbiter said. "We simply wish to have a peaceful discussion. Perhaps we could even come to an agreement," the invader said. "If only everyone had that attitude," the Arbiter commented. "Very well. Take 2 of your soldiers with you. I will also take 2 of my soldiers with me. We'll meet halfway between me and you," the man said as he pointed to the middle of the 2. The captain raised his hands. "Sire, you can't possibly do this. This could be a trap. You're our last beacon of hope. We can't afford to lose you," he protested. The Arbiter remained calm. "Everything in our lives comes with a certain degree of risk, so call me selfish and reckless. But I think this is a risk worth taking," he said. "If you want to help, let 2 of your finest soldiers accompany me." The captain reluctantly nodded. "Fine. Emil and Velini accompany him," he yelled. "Yes, Captain," the 2 said in unison. The 3 started marching. The ground was wet, as always. If you went off the main road, you'd most likely sink into a bed of mud and water. Valand was a swampy province, where there was perpetual rainfall and an abundance of poisonous animals. The 100 or so meters they had to walk felt like 1,000,000. With each step, the tension in the air became stronger and more palpable. Then there were the loud footsteps of their possible foes. It felt like a giant was walking across these grounds. Each time one of those behemoths took a step, it was like thunder was raining down upon the earth. Even though the light was dim due to the sun going down and the clouds above him, he could still make out that these were massive pillars of iron and steel. Their eyes, however, had a slight glow to them, and yet the Arbiter was calm, even content with whatever might befall him. He hid his face behind a mask, but Emil was certain that under that layer of bronze and iron, He was fine with all of this, unfazed with his possible death. Just a few steps left, that was what Emil was thinking as they neared the meeting point. The thundering footsteps of the giants finally stopped as they reached the meeting point. "Salutations, Sir Sarnation," the Goliath said as it took off its helmet, revealing a face similar to an elf in complexion, yet slightly darker. "I'm Major Darius Gamal," he said with a this time gentler voice. Maybe it was due to that Emil could now see that this was a person, or perhaps it was because the helmet was removed, but the man's voice became a lot more soothing and less coarse. The man had wavy, short hair which was a shade of black. His eyes were a darker shade of brown. His cheekbones were defined and rather high. He also possessed a much more defined and rigid facial structure than most elves. His ears weren't pointed either, and yet he was too tall to be a dwarf and not green enough to be an orc. Which race did this man belong to was a question which continued to irk Emil as he continued to observe the man. Maybe a half-elf. Even then, the suit of armor he wore was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was made by a truly exceptional craftsman. You couldn't observe any stain on it. "Greetings to you, Major," the Arbiter said. "Why are you here?" he proceeded to inquire. "Simple," Darius said. "We wish to install you on the throne of the Imperium." That was everything except simple. But why the Arbiter? He wasn't even an elf, let alone an elf with a claim on the Imperial throne. So why was this strange man making such an outrageous demand? Before either Darius or the Arbiter could say something, the Arbiter removed his mask. To the guards' shock, they didn't see an orc or Ammonai. They saw a pure-blooded elf. The Arbiter looked no older than 30. Elves couldn't grow beards, and so he didn't have one. He had a pointy chin and bright purple eyes. He had medium-length blonde hair and a bleak, completely white complexion. "I don't desire more responsibility than I already possess," he said. "I don't desire an empire, I merely desire a peaceful and just life." Darius sighed. "That is a noble goal," he said. "And yet, by refusing to take responsibility, you doom millions to lead brutish, short, and miserable lives. I'm done with imperial politics. They're tiring and pointless." The Arbiter said, "So I refuse," he said as he put his mask back on and turned around. "Have a nice evening," he said as he walked away. "Then tell me, is there anything you desire?" Darius asked. The Arbiter turned around to meet Darius's gaze. "I've already told you what I desire," he said. "Actually." He stopped and walked back to the armored man. "There's one more thing I wish for." The Arbiter said, "If you somehow manage to grant this village peace and safety, as well as a guarded warehouse with enough supplies to last it through the upcoming year, I'll consider you offer." "Deal," Darius said. The Arbiter once again removed his mask and raised his eyebrow. "I'm asking quite a bit of you," he said. "Are you sure you'll be able to do that?" "I'll have it done within 3 days." The Major said, "I promise you that." "Very well. Then I suppose I'll also need to uphold my end of the bargain." The Arbiter said, "So tell me, how do you plan on usurping the throne?" he said as a small smirk graced his face. Sarnation looked on in awe as dozens of human machines were constructing a formidable wall around their village. The humans, as they called themselves, had already replenished a year's worth of food in their warehouse and completely restored it to its former glory. On top of all of that, they had also supplied the militia with brand new armor and weapons. How they managed to get all of that to the admittedly quite isolated village was a great unknown to the former Arbiter. "It is time to leave," Darius said as he placed his hand on the former Arbiter's shoulder. Sarnation nodded. "I suppose it is," he said to Darius. "Off to usurp the Imperium's throne," he said with a humorous tone. "Sir, we'll start moving whenever you give the signal," one of Darius's lackeys said. Darius acknowledged him with a nod. "Right," he said. He turned to Sarnation with a faint smile. "Let's start." Sarnation nodded. "Let us." A few hours later, they were still walking across the muddy path that was considered a road. The swamps and bogs of Valand were filled to the brim with dangerous creatures. Making any journey here was perilous. You could get eaten by a black wolf or torn apart by a pack of ghouls at any point. The journey was awkward to say at the very least. In an attempt to relieve some of that awkwardness, Sarnation decided to start a conversation. "So, how do you like Valand?" he asked the human. The human thought about the question for a few moments before giving a response. "Could be worse. A bit gray, though," he answered. "Nothing like the deserts that were my home." Deserts? The realm of the humans was truly fascinating in that case. Large heaps of sand. That was what his books described deserts as. Sarnation was always intrigued by the foreign and unknown. "How do you come by water?" Sarnation asked. "I heard deserts were pretty dry." "They are, mostly," Darius answered as he kept walking at a fast pace. "There are, however, wells dotted around them." That was worth investigating. The only desert Naravor had was to the south of the Imperium. The only creatures that inhabited these lands beyond the jungles of Kulanong were the Arismer, a race of beast folk, lived. They were described as massive, centaur-like people, with great strength and a hulking frame. Their fur was dense and almost impossible to get through with any weapon. They wielded massive hammers made for war with two front limbs. "I assume you aren't from around here either?" Darius asked Sarnation. Sarnation nodded. "I'm from the metropolis of Reimstadt, one busy with trade and with corruption," he said. "If you don't mind me asking, why were you exiled?" Darius asked the elf, who, upon hearing that question, looked somberly out at the swamp they were traversing. "All you need to know is that I was always the failed son, and the moment I noticed the problems with the Imperium, I was to be silenced, so I fled," he said with a hint of sadness. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked," Darius said as he empathized with the elf. "No matter," he responded. "If I didn't want you to know, I wouldn't have told you." After he finished his sentence, he heard a twig snap. Not due to him stepping on it, no, this was something else. "Did you hear that as well?" Darius asked. Sarnation nodded. "I'll cast a detection spell," he said as he focused his Ternesia and combined it together. Unlike a fireball or a bolt of lightning, which only needed to be mentally molded, a proper spell needed to be casted. Casting required quite a bit of stuff. For one, a focusing object was required. In his case, it was his amulet, a Valtorn kin. Valtorn kins were truths of the universe etched into a physical vessel. These truths were universal laws, always to be obeyed by everyone and everything. While you could cast spells without a focusing object, it was difficult and required rigorous practice. Maybe only a few sorcerers in the Imperium could pull it off, and they all were in service of the Keyser. Some sorcerers used gallicans, weapons with the same properties as Valtorn keens, but trading intensity for endurance. Many other focusing objects exist. Even books, when properly enchanted, can serve as them. Casting proper spells required one, because it wasn't just dispelling Ternesia and transforming it into energy. It was completely restructuring it, forming bolts, fireballs, draining and giving Ternesia, however, didn't require one. It required a caster which was capable of bearing the anguish of subjecting your mind to a universal truth. Luckily, however, it only gets easier from your first time. "Uo et farno levitis dal tervo, et revel don position," Sarnation said as he channeled his Ternesia into the focusing object. As he commanded, water and fire arose and created a fire above the heads of every living being around them. "Heat scans indicate 30 beings," one of the humans said, which was confirmed by Sarnation's spell, as 30 flames arose from the forest. The 3 people ran out. "Ghouls!" Sarnation yelled as he pointed to them. Before Sarnation could channel Ternesia, he was knocked down onto the ground by one of the ghouls. Well, this was the end. That was the thought that raced through his mind. He closed his eyes, ready to die. He then heard a loud boom. He opened his eyes. His assailant's head was completely melted off into hot goo. He pushed the ghoul off him. In front of him was another ghoul, another loud bang, another melted head. 28 to go, he thought, as he channeled some Ternesia. He shaped it into a fireball and let loose. 3 ghouls were burned to a crisp, which bought Sarnation time to fall back. "Get to the back!" one of the humans said, as they were seemingly preparing something. Sarnation nodded and ran to the back. A few moments later, and the soldier let out a massive wave of fire. It wasn't magical, however. The ghouls screamed in anguish as they were burned alive. The little skin on their bones was completely burned as their hideous three-eyed faces hit the ground. That had killed off the majority. The few ghouls left scurried away. The humans, however, didn't relent. More loud bangs filled the air as more ghouls screamed in pain. They weren't hunting the humans were hunting them. All of a sudden, however, the ghouls stopped running. It was like they saw something more dangerous in the direction they were going, screaming in fear, pain, and confusion as they ran towards the humans who were mowing them down without any effort. A few moments later, and all the ghouls lay dead. Then, however, they started hearing stomps. "Sarnation, do you have any idea what is happening?" Darius asked as he turned towards the elf. "An undead giant, perhaps," the elf said. "They're giants who turned into ghouls. Extremely dangerous. Even regular ghouls are afraid of them," he said. "Just what I needed," Darius said as he braced himself. "You know anything else about them?" he asked. "I can tell you how corpses turn into ghouls, but that wouldn't do you much good," Sarnation said as he lifted his hand to his chin. "They're undead creatures. Just cutting off their arms and legs won't work. Punching a hole through their heart won't work either. You either have to set them ablaze or decapitate them," he said. "That's something at least, thanks." Darius said, "Smith Lynn, I want you to try and distract it. Carter try to explode it somehow." The human ordered his lackeys. The soldiers nodded and a chorus of "yes, sirs" erupted. A few minutes later and the giant had neared them. It was the height of all the trees surrounding them. It neared 30 meters. Its face had 13 eyes. Each one of those were focused on the group of humans and the elf. It had loose flesh hanging off its cheekbones. It had a ghastly and nightmare-inducing appearance. Its body was even worse. Its intestines were exposed for all to see. The left side of its pectoral muscle was torn off, revealing its somehow still working organs. The right side of its pectoral muscle had its skin torn off. At the end of each of its arms was a clawed hand. Underneath its claws, you could clearly see the blood of the many creatures it had already killed. The giant let out a monstrous laugh as it neared the group of humans, who steeled themselves. The humans started blasting it with everything they had. Chunks of bone, organ, and skin flew out the giant. It, however, didn't stop. Carter, the soldier ordered to explode it, was doing something, however. Bang after bang rang out, and yet the giant did not halt its approach. It continued to stomp towards the armored retinue. It neared one of the soldiers who tried making a run for it, and yet failed miserably. Sarnation looked on as the giant gripped the human in its massive hand. Unable to simply stand by and watch, he devised a plan. With everything he had left, he conjured up a massive blade. He focused on his amulet. "Ispirit tan que ferum levitis," he chanted as he collapsed onto the ground. From the earth arose a gargantuan fiery blade, a great 2 meters in length and broad in diameter too. With the last bits of his strength, Sarnation lifted his hand upwards, using telepathy to raise the blade through the giant's arm. It screamed its pain as its hand fell off. Sarnation focused. "Now to decapitate the beast," he said as he raised his hand once more and aligned it. Before he, however, had the chance to take its head, a missile flew through the air right to the giant's head. It exploded on impact, leaving a massive hole where the giant's face once was. With no mouth left to scream with, the giant ghoul collapsed onto the ground, as did Sarnation, completely spent.